Hello and welcome back, my incredible AP Insight family. Abby Phillip here. New testimony is emerging from the House investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's network, and what's coming out raises serious, uncomfortable questions about how much justice has actually been served in this case. Let's start with what the recently released Epstein files actually revealed, because that context matters enormously here. Those documents, the ones that only became public because Congress pushed back against the Trump administration and forced their release, contained something significant. Federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice had compiled leads, real leads, named individuals and redacted individuals, people who moved in Epstein's world, people documented as part of his orbit. The DOJ had those threads in hand, and when you look at the full scope of what those documents contained, the conclusion is hard to avoid. Almost none of those leads were seriously pursued. One prosecution came out of all of it. One, Ghislaine Maxwell. That's the full extent of what federal law enforcement delivered after years of documented evidence pointing to a broader network of enablers, associates, and participants. The DOJ, under multiple administrations, not just one, not just the other, let those threads go cold. That's not a partisan talking point. That's what the record shows. So what's happening now? Congress has decided to do something about it. Some of the same lawmakers who fought to get those files released are now conducting the kind of investigative work that federal prosecutors declined to pursue. They're going back through the evidence. They're calling witnesses. They're putting people under oath. And today, that process reached someone who has largely stayed out of the spotlight throughout this entire saga. A powerful billionaire who built one of the most recognizable retail empires in American history and who had one of the longest and most financially significant relationships with Jeffrey Epstein of anyone connected to this case. Les Wexner sat for a deposition today. He answered questions under oath. The interview was conducted at his residence in Ohio, and while Democratic lawmakers led the questioning, Republican staff members were also present. This was not a voluntary press conference. This was compelled testimony, and the distinction matters. Why is Wexner so central to this story? Because when you look at the money, and in any serious investigation you always follow the money, Wexner's name is everywhere. Lawmakers working on this probe say their evidence indicates that over $1 billion moved from Wexner to Epstein across the span of their relationship. $1 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's not ambiguous. Records indicate the cumulative transfers added up to that staggering figure, and Wexner's name reportedly appears in the Epstein files more than 1,000 times. Think about that number for a moment. 1,000 references. One photograph released by the House Oversight Committee shows the two men together. One individual in the image has been redacted for reasons investigators have cited, but Epstein and Wexner are visible, socializing, clearly at ease with each other. That single photograph is one data point among hundreds of documented contacts and interactions. Now, Wexner does have something to point to in his defense. When Epstein first ran into serious legal trouble in Florida, his initial conviction for soliciting prostitution involving a minor, Wexner cut ties. Documents support that timeline. And Wexner's position has long included the claim that Epstein actually stole from him, that money was taken without authorization, and that some of it was eventually recovered. That is part of the public record. Today, Wexner's family released a statement alongside his testimony. In it, he describes something that many people will find either credible or completely implausible, depending on how you look at it. Despite his own decades of business experience, despite his reputation as a sharp and successful executive who built Victoria's Secret and L brands into household names, Wexner says he was deceived. His word for Epstein, a world-class con man, and Wexner says he carries deep regret for ever having brought Epstein into his life. He went further than that. Wexner's testimony today included a characterization of how Epstein operated, specifically that Epstein was a calculated manipulator who kept different groups of people entirely separate from one another, that he would run different operations with different people, using different language, maintaining different personas, depending on who he was dealing with. Compartmentalization, in other words. Wexner's argument is that this compartmentalization is precisely why he, as one part of Epstein's world, never had visibility into what was happening in another part. And here's where the testimony gets complicated, because there is actually some evidentiary support for the idea that Epstein operated this way. The emails that have been reviewed do show him shifting tone, shifting vocabulary, shifting his entire presentation depending on his audience. That's documented. Investigators tracking his communications have noted it. So the general concept Wexner is describing isn't invented. It corresponds to a real pattern. The question, and it's the central question, is whether Wexner knew, whether a man of his intelligence, his access, his resources, and his decade-plus financial entanglement with Epstein genuinely had no window into the criminal activity happening on the other side of those walls. Was he truly a financial victim who happened to be victimized by the same person who was victimizing young women in entirely different ways? Or does the scale and depth of their relationship make that story difficult to accept? Wexner's position, stated plainly, is this: Epstein had two categories of victims: people like Wexner, who were defrauded financially, and people, young women, girls, who were sexually trafficked. And Wexner's claim is that these two categories never intersected in any way that he was aware of. He saw himself as one kind of victim and had no knowledge of the other kind. He maintains he faces no legal exposure, that no allegations from the DOJ have ever been directed at him, and that this has always been the truth. That's his testimony. Now ask yourself whether Congress found it convincing. The Democratic lawmakers who led today's questioning did not hide their skepticism. Their statements after the deposition were measured, but the message underneath them was clear. One member noted that Wexner appeared strangely uninformed about the sheer volume of money he had transferred to Epstein, suggesting either a remarkable lack of oversight over his own finances or something else entirely. Another observed that Wexner seemed to be actively minimizing how close the two men actually were, despite the documented record showing the opposite. One of the more pointed observations from lawmakers: the longer the deposition ran, the less Wexner seemed to know. More time, more questions, fewer answers. Members described hitting dead ends repeatedly. The expectation now is that they will come away from this deposition with more open questions than resolved ones. The posture Wexner adopted, see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing, was noted with visible frustration. But frustration isn't evidence, and investigators, whatever their instincts, need to work from what they can prove. The real test of today's deposition isn't whether it was satisfying. Investigations rarely are. The test is whether it was truthful, and that determination will take time and additional work to establish. One specific line of questioning involved Epstein's private island, the property in the U.S. Virgin Islands that has become synonymous with the trafficking operation at the core of these crimes. Wexner's answer on that point: he visited once, accompanied by his wife and children. One trip. That was the extent of his connection to the island, according to his own account. That answer will draw comparisons. Just recently, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary in Donald Trump's administration, made a similar admission about his own visit to the island. For years, Lutnick denied any such connection. The only reason he finally acknowledged it was that the released files made denial impossible. He was caught. He confessed. And Trump, who campaigned loudly on promises to expose the full truth about Epstein's network and hold everyone accountable, chose not to remove Lutnick from his cabinet, not to sanction him, not even to publicly acknowledge the deception. The man who said he would get to the bottom of this kept a confirmed island visitor in a top government post without explanation. That contrast between the rhetoric of accountability and the reality of how the current administration has actually handled these revelations deserves direct attention, and we will continue tracking the broader picture of who is facing consequences and who is not. What you see playing out across multiple investigations right now is a pattern of accountability that is selective, inconsistent, and frequently dependent on what the political stakes are for the person involved. Some individuals have been ousted from their positions. Some are facing active investigation, some are navigating ongoing professional and legal fallout, and others are walking free while sitting in cabinet-level offices, shielded by the very administration that once promised to be the one to finally expose the truth. On that screen, you'll also notice a recent addition to the list of those facing consequences. Kathy Remler, a Democratic attorney who was removed from her position at Goldman Sachs within the past week. This is not a story that falls neatly on one side of the political spectrum. Epstein's network reached across party lines, across industries, across decades. The reckoning, to whatever degree it is actually happening, is touching people from multiple directions. Meanwhile, Ghislaine Maxwell, the only person federal prosecutors actually convicted in connection with Epstein's trafficking operation, continues to refuse cooperation with the House investigation. She has invoked her Fifth Amendment rights. That's her constitutional right, and it cannot be stripped from her without a specific legal mechanism: immunity. If Congress chose to immunize Maxwell, to formally protect her from any further prosecution based on what she might reveal, they could then compel her to testify because she would no longer have the right to stay silent on self-incrimination grounds. No such step has been taken. That door remains closed, and Maxwell continues to say nothing. So where does all of this leave us tonight? What you have is investigative momentum building in Congress at the same time that the Department of Justice remains notably inactive on the same subject matter. That gap between what lawmakers say they're trying to uncover and what federal prosecutors are actually pursuing is wide and growing wider. Congress is issuing subpoenas, compelling depositions, publishing documents, and following leads. The DOJ, by contrast, has been silent on any new investigative activity related to the Epstein network since Maxwell's conviction. And it's important to say this clearly: the failure to follow those leads did not begin with any single administration. Epstein died in federal custody in August of 2019. The leads that were documented and then left unpursued span the Biden DOJ and the Trump DOJ, both. The files showing the leads that were apparently not followed came from a period that implicates multiple attorneys general, multiple administrations, multiple political eras. This is not a problem that belongs to one party. It is a systemic failure of federal law enforcement to seriously reckon with what the evidence in front of them actually pointed toward. That's the story Congress is now trying to tell. Whether they have the tools, the political will, and ultimately the evidence to tell it completely remains to be seen. What is not in question is that the DOJ, across administrations, made a choice, either deliberately or through inaction, not to follow where the evidence led. Hello, and welcome back, my incredible AP Insight family. Abby Phillip here.